Here, you'll find all the essential vocabulary to speak about this topic at an advanced level with confidence and fluency.
All right, so buckle up because today we are diving into something that just might completely flip your assumptions about Gen Z, and that is their relationship with sex.
Oh, yeah.
You know, the stereotype, the internet in their pocket, open to seemingly anything.
Right.
They must be a hypersexualized generation, right?
Yeah.
Well, here's the curveball.
Okay.
Research suggests they are actually having less sex than millennials or Gen Xers were at the same age.
Yeah, it is one of those things that makes you go, wait, really?
Right.
We picture Gen Z constantly on the dating apps, hooking up left and right.
Hookup culture.
But the data tells a different story.
Totally. And to figure out why, we've got two really cool sources for this deep dive.
Okay.
First, a video essay called Gen Z, the Less Sex Generation.
I love that.
It's got experts, personal stories, even some humor mixed in.
Nice.
And then to get even nerdier,
Oh, yeah.
there's this academic paper analyzing the language used in the video, like the slang phrases, even proverbs that reveal how Gen Z talks about intimacy.
Having both these sources is key.
Yeah.
Because we're not just looking at stats, but the cultural context, too.
Exactly.
It's not enough to know they're having less sex, but we want to understand why.
I love that.
Yeah.
Okay, so hit me with the facts. How much less sex are we even talking about here?
So multiple studies show a significant drop. For example, back in 2011,
Okay.
22% of young adults aged 18 to 30 said they hadn't had a sexual partner in the past year.
Okay.
Fast forward to 2021,
All right.
that number jumps to 33% for women
Wow.
and a whopping 43% for men.
Those are some big jumps.
Yeah,
And this isn't just a blip, right? Other research backs this up.
absolutely.
Yeah.
The U.S. General Social Survey, focusing on men under 25, found that those reporting no sexual activity in the past year went from 18.9% in 2000 to almost 31% in 2018.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So this trend is showing up consistently.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we can't ignore the obvious here.
What's that?
Porn.
Right.
Gen Z has more access to it than any generation before, but
Yeah.
and here's where it gets interesting. The experts in the video suggest that easy access to porn might actually be a factor in less real-life sex.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, it makes sense.
Yeah.
One psychologist put it this way. Young men are getting a lot of their needs met online.
Okay.
So there's less drive to seek out in-person connections.
That's such a counterintuitive point. More access to explicit content, yet less actual sex, makes you think about what's really driving the desire for connection.
Exactly. It raises the question, is this just about sex or is it about something bigger?
Okay. I am intrigued. What's the bigger picture here?
Well, the video essay highlights this quote from an NYU psychology professor who calls it a crisis of connection.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it's not just about romantic relationships, but feeling disconnected in general from ourselves, from each other.
So it's like a loneliness epidemic? Is that what we're talking about here?
In a way, yes. And it's stark when you compare generations.
Okay.
In the 90s, 55% of men had 6 or more close friends.
6 or more. Wow.
By 2021, that plummeted to just 27%.
Hold on. More than half the guys used to have a solid group of friends, and now it's barely a quarter.
I know.
That's wild. But maybe people just connect differently now, like
Yeah.
social media.
That's the assumption, but the numbers don't really support it. What's even more alarming is that 15% of men now report having no close friends at all.
Wow.
Back in 1990, that was only 3%.
Those numbers are pretty sobering. It really does make you wonder what impact this lack of connection is having on people's lives, especially Gen Z.
And we can't forget the elephant in the room,
Which is?
the pandemic.
Oh, right.
Those were crucial years for Gen Z, a time when they should have been figuring out relationships, going on dates, navigating all those awkward but essential social experiences. But instead, they were stuck at home, glued to screens.
Yeah. Talk about a buzzkill. Imagine trying to have your first kiss with a mask on.
I know.
It's no wonder those formative years were disrupted. But was it just the pandemic, or were there other factors already at play here?
Yeah, I think the pandemic certainly threw gasoline on the fire, but Gen Z was facing some unique challenges even before that.
Like what?
Think about it. They came of age during the rise of social media, economic uncertainty, and what some call helicopter parenting.
Mm-hmm.
All of this contributed to a sense of delayed adulthood,
Okay.
which makes navigating intimacy even more complicated.
Okay. I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together. It's like they were dealt a tough hand right from the start.
Hmm.
But how does this delayed adulthood you mentioned actually play out in their lives? What does it look like?
Well, one expert in the video pointed out that in societies where people live longer and education takes longer,
Oh, yeah.
the whole pace of development slows down.
That makes sense.
It makes sense that if you don't feel like an adult yet, you're less likely to engage in things we traditionally associate with adulthood, like sex and serious relationships.
So it's not that they're choosing to delay adulthood. It's more like the goalposts have moved. They're
Mhm.
stuck in this in between zone, not quite kids, but not fully independent adults either.
Exactly. And that has real world implications. Think about it.
Yeah.
Many Gen Zers are living with their parents longer, delaying getting their driver's licenses and struggling to find stable jobs. It makes it harder to meet people, go on dates, have the kind of privacy and freedom that often go hand in hand with romantic relationships.
Trying to have a romantic evening when you're worried about your mom walking in?
Exactly.
Yeah, that's not exactly a recipe for success. But here's something that really struck me in the video. It's not all doom and gloom.
Right.
While a lot of the reasons for this decline in sexual activity seem negative anxiety, isolation, financial stress,
Hmm.
not everyone sees it as a bad thing.
That's where things get really thought provoking.
Yeah.
What if Gen Z is choosing different priorities?
Interesting.
Maybe they're looking at relationships and intimacy in a whole new way.
So it's not about being anti sex, it's about questioning the old assumptions and deciding for themselves what works for them.
Right. And this is where Gen Z's relationship with the sex positive movement gets interesting.
Okay, so we're talking about a generation that's seemingly less focused on sex, but maybe more focused on genuine connection and questioning societal norms. Help me unpack this whole sex positive thing.
Okay.
How is Gen Z's view different?
Well, millennials really embrace the sex positive movement as a way to break free from the shame and silence of previous generations.
Hmm.
But for some in Gen Z, it feels like that pendulum swung too far.
So they're pushing back against the idea that everyone should be having lots of sex.
Exactly. Some Gen Zers feel like sex positive often led to pressure, especially on women,
Yeah,
to engage in sexual activities, even if they weren't really comfortable.
that makes sense. It's like the message became you should be having sex and lots of it,
Right.
rather than you should feel empowered to make your own choices about sex, whatever those choices may be.
Right. And the analysis of the language in the video essay really highlights this. They
Yeah.
point out how Gen Z is more likely to use phrases like sexual liberation or body autonomy,
Okay.
which emphasize personal choice and control as opposed to just sex positive.
So it's less about being pro sex and more about being pro choice when it comes to sex.
Hmm.
Interesting. And, you know, it's not just about avoiding pressure. The video also touches on the rise of asexuality.
Absolutely. Gen Z is far more aware of different sexual orientations and identities, and that includes asexuality simply not being interested in sex.
And for those who identify as asexual, it's not about abstaining from sex for moral reasons or anything like that. It's just about who they are.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. One young woman in the video, a nursing assistant, put it this way: I think sex is kind of gross.
Oh, wow.
And you know what? That's totally valid.
It really challenges the assumption that everyone wants and needs sex to be happy. It's about respecting the full spectrum of human experience.
And that's a powerful message, not just for Gen Z, but for all of us. It's a reminder that there's no one right way to experience sexuality.
You know, hearing all of this, it makes me wonder if Gen Z is pushing back against these old expectations around sex. Does that mean they're finding other ways to connect and find intimacy?
That's a great question. And The sources hint at a few possibilities. For one, the video essay talks about how Gen Z is much more open to exploring non romantic relationships like close friendships and chosen families.
So they're redefining what meaningful connection looks like. It's not just about finding a romantic partner anymore.
Exactly. And the pandemic might have actually accelerated this trend.
Mm.
Forced isolation made
Mm.
people realize how much they craved social connection, even if it wasn't romantic.
It's like that saying, absence makes the heart grow fonder, but for friendships.
Exactly. And then there's technology. While social media gets a bad rap for fueling loneliness and comparison,
Hmm.
it can also be a powerful tool for building community. Gen Z is really good at finding their people online,
Okay.
whether it's through shared interests, hobbies, or even just a sense of humor.
So it's not all bad news on the technology front. There are ways it can actually help with connection.
Absolutely. Think about online gaming communities,
Yeah.
fan groups, even just sharing memes with friends. These can all create a sense of belonging and shared experience.
It's interesting because for a lot of people, those online connections can feel just as real and meaningful as in person ones.
And for Gen Z, who grew up with this technology, it's often a seamless part of their lives.
Yeah.
They're not as hung up on the online versus offline distinction that older generations might be.
So maybe Gen Z isn't having less sex because they're less interested in intimacy, but because they're finding intimacy in different ways,
Hmm.
ways that feel more authentic and less pressured.
I think that's a very insightful way to put it. They're rewriting the rules of intimacy, and in the process, they're challenging us to rethink our own assumptions about connection.
Okay, so if we're rethinking assumptions, let's talk about porn again for a second.
Okay.
We touched on how easy access might be contributing to less real life sex. But the video also mentions that some young people are using porn in a more mindful way, right?
That's a really important point. Some experts in the video talked about how Gen Z is more likely to see porn as just one form of sexual expression rather than a guidebook for how sex should be.
So it's less about trying to replicate what they see in porn and more about using it as a tool for exploration or even just entertainment.
Exactly. And some young people are even using porn to learn about different bodies, sexual practices, and even to communicate their own desires to partners.
So it's not just about passive consumption, it's about taking control of their own sexual experiences and education.
I think that's a really important shift. And it ties back to what we were saying earlier about Gen Z's emphasis on personal choice and agency.
It's like they're saying, we're going to use this tool on our own terms in a way that feels empowering and authentic for us.
Exactly. And that I think is a much healthier and more realistic approach to porn than what we've seen in previous generations.
This is also fascinating. It feels like Gen Z is leading a revolution in how we think about sex relationships and connection. But what does this mean for the future?
Yeah.
Are we all headed for a less sexy, more cerebral existence?
Well, I don't think it's about being less sexy at all. It's about redefining what sexy means. Maybe it's less about physical performance and more about emotional intimacy, vulnerability, and genuine connection.
So it's not that passion is dead, it's just evolving.
Exactly. And who knows, maybe this Gen Z approach will lead to even deeper, more fulfilling relationships in the long run.
All right, I'm starting to see the upside here, but let's be real. There are still some serious challenges facing Gen Z, right? We talked about the mental health crisis, the economic pressures.
Mm,
How do those fit into this whole conversation about intimacy and connection?
that's a crucial piece of the puzzle. You can't talk about Gen Z's relationship with sex without acknowledging the immense pressure they're under.
It's like they're trying to figure out love and relationships while simultaneously dealing with a global pandemic, climate change, and an uncertain economic future. No wonder they're feeling overwhelmed.
And the data bears this out. Studies show Gen Z is experiencing higher rates of anxiety, depression, and loneliness than any generation before them.
So it's a vicious cycle, right? Less sex might be a symptom of these larger anxieties, but it also has the potential to make those anxieties worse.
Exactly. It's all interconnected. And we can't forget about the economic piece. Gen Z is facing a lot of financial instability, student loan debt, a competitive job market, the rising cost of living.
It's like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? If your basic needs for safety and security aren't met, it's hard to prioritize things like love and belonging.
Right. And the video essay highlights this by pointing out the stark contrast between low income and high income Gen Zers when it comes to sexual activity.
Okay.
52% of young Californians living below the poverty line reported having no sex in the past year.
Wow.
Compared to 33% of high income young adults, that's a huge difference.
So it's not just about individual choices, it's about systemic factors that are creating barriers to intimacy and connection for many Gen Zers.
Absolutely. We can't ignore the social and economic context. And this is where I think Gen Z's critique of the sex positive movement becomes even more relevant.
Okay, help me connect those dots. How does economic inequality tie into the sex positive debate?
Well, some critics of the sex positive movement argue that it often ignores the realities of power and privilege.
Mm-hmm.
They say it can create this pressure to be sexually liberated, but that pressure doesn't affect everyone equally.
So, if you're already struggling with financial insecurity, housing insecurity, or discrimination, the pressure to also be sexually adventurous can feel like just one more burden.
Exactly. And for some Gen Zers, rejecting that pressure is a way of reclaiming their own agency and setting boundaries.
It's about saying, my worth isn't tied to how much sex I'm having or how comfortable I am talking about it.
Right. And that's a powerful message, especially in a world where young people are constantly bombarded with messages about how they should look, act, and behave.
This has been such an eye opening conversation. I'm really starting to appreciate the nuance here. It's not just about Gen Z having less sex, it's about a whole generation grappling with bigger questions about connection, intimacy, and what it means to be human in a rapidly changing world.
I completely agree. And I think there's a lot we can all learn from their journey.
Well, I, for one, am eager to hear what those lessons are. Maybe Gen Z can teach the rest of us a thing or two about building more authentic and fulfilling relationships. So, we've covered a lot of ground here, from declining sexual activity to the pressures of a changing world. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I'm curious, what can we learn from Gen Z?
Yeah.
They're facing these challenges head on. Maybe they've got some wisdom to share.
I think there's a lot we can glean from their experience, first and foremost. Gen Z is showing us the importance of open and honest communication.
Mm-hmm.
They're much more comfortable talking about mental health, setting boundaries, and expressing their needs in relationships.
Which is something older generations often struggle with,
Well,
right?
exactly.
Like, we're so used to keeping those things bottled up.
Hmm. But Gen Z is normalizing vulnerability and honesty. It's like they're saying, let's skip the guessing games and just be upfront about what we're feeling and what we want.
That's so refreshing, and I bet it makes for much healthier relationships in the long run.
I think so too. And it ties into another big lesson. Gen Z is teaching us the importance of consent and respect.
Okay.
They've grown up with more awareness of sexual assault and consent education than any generation before.
So it's not just about saying yes or no, it's about creating a culture where everyone feels safe and empowered to express their desires and boundaries without fear of judgment.
Absolutely. And this focus on consent goes beyond just the bedroom. Gen Z is also leading the way in challenging traditional gender roles, advocating for LGBTQ plus rights, and pushing for greater inclusivity in all aspects of life.
It's like they're rewriting the rules of engagement, creating a world where everyone has the freedom to be themselves and to connect with others in authentic ways without being limited by outdated social norms.
Exactly. And all of this requires a high degree of self awareness, which is another key takeaway from Gen Z.
Mm-hmm.
They're facing immense pressure from all sides: social media, family, the economy,
Yeah.
and they're learning to prioritize their own mental and emotional well being.
It's like they're giving themselves permission to opt out of the hustle culture, to set boundaries, and to focus on what truly matters to them, which is incredibly important, especially in a world that's constantly demanding more.
You hit the nail on the head. It's a radical act of self preservation.
Yeah.
And it reminds me of that saying, you can't pour from an empty cup.
Right.
Gen Z is showing us that we need to fill our own cups first before we can truly connect with and support others.
So it's not selfish to prioritize your own well being, it's actually essential for building healthy relationships.
Precisely. And finally, I think Gen Z is teaching us that intimacy and connection can take many forms. It's not just about romantic relationships or sexual experiences, it's about finding meaningful ways to connect with ourselves, with our communities, and with the world around us.
It's about appreciating the simple things, like spending time with loved ones, pursuing passions, or just being present in the moment.
Right. And that, I believe, is a message that transcends generations. It's a universal truth that we all need to rediscover, that genuine connection in all its forms is essential for our happiness and well being.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into Gen Z and their relationship with sex, I think it's safe to say they're not a sexless generation.
Right.
They're a generation that's redefining what sex and intimacy mean in a complex and demanding world.
And their journey can serve as a guide for the rest of us as we navigate the challenges and opportunities of modern life, seeking connection and meaning in a world that's constantly evolving.
It's been such a thought-provoking conversation.
Yeah, it really has.
If Gen Z is prioritizing deeper connection and self-awareness, what does that mean for the future of love relationships and human interaction? It's a question worth pondering both individually and as a society. And on that note, we'll leave you to do just that. Until next time, keep diving deep and keep those questions coming.